Some of the biggest opportunities come with the problem. Sometimes there's a startup business that falls over. That's often 2 or 3 years in because of an illness of the key person, or sometimes it's they've run out of money, or they may have run out of will and become overwhelmed, and they kind of want to bail on it, particularly if they're loss-making. So what happens is it starts to shrink through passivity and probably a lack of need for income.
Hey, welcome back to the Scale My Clinic podcast. I'm here with Todd. Morning, Todd.
Hey, Sachin.
Welcome. So today we're going to be talking about a topic that is applicable to both existing owners and people who may be thinking about getting into practice ownership. And that topic is, I want to buy a general practice. And so, Todd, you've done this quite a few times and helped many people do this. Maybe we'll start with the first stage. Like, I'm looking for a practice. I want to find a practice, and maybe walk us through that. And then after that, we'll talk about, hey, I found the practice and now I'm going through the process of buying. Maybe start with, in the looking stage, what should people be thinking about, or how should they go about looking for a general practice to buy?
This is good fun. And I think it's really important that people that are looking at becoming future owners, or an existing owner that's maybe expanding through purchasing an existing practice, need to remember what their competitive advantage is as a GP owner. That's often desired by a vendor, someone selling, because they often want to know that the business is going to good hands to another clinician, and then clinicians can provide flexibility to the owner as to what they might do in the future. And we'll talk a bit about that in a moment. But in terms of the types of practices that become available for sale. So people get a little bit obsessed as to why somebody's selling something, a little bit like a car, why are you selling it? I've sold a few cars that almost everybody's like, why are you selling it? You're like, just people sell stuff, at some point in life, it's not that it's necessarily a problem. However, some of the biggest opportunities come with the problem. So the sort of main groups, I would classify them as such. And sometimes there's a startup business that falls over. That's often 2 or 3 years in because of an illness of the key person, or sometimes it's they've run out of money, or they may have run out of will and become overwhelmed, and they kind of want to bail on it, particularly if they're loss-making. And so in this case, I'd have, some of the larger clinics, like 8 to 10 rooms, and they never really got beyond 2 GPs, that kind of thing. The next group I'd say is the post-peak. I think these are really common. So these are clinics that were usually humming with multi-owners, often somewhere between 3 and 4, but I've seen as many as 7 or 8 owners in this kind of category. And they often were really humming businesses when the owners on average were kind of 50 to 55. They're often cohorts of similarly aged owners. And what they do is, because it's humming, they just kind of leave it. So what happens is it starts to shrink through passivity and probably a lack of need for income. Working the asset is hard. The kids have probably left school. There's all those things that are drivers for them to, maybe they paid off their home, all those kind of things. And so you see these clinics that their former glory was 10, 15 years ago. And what happens is the owners look around and go, shit, I'm 65, 70. We're all getting old here. Practice managers 75, and they're all kind of, it's more like the God's waiting room than anything else. They're looking around thinking this place needs a bit of work. They're often like those really old people that have lived in their house for ages. It's a bit worn out. There's those bloody A4 sheets of paper stuck all over the walls, mismatching paint colors. The equipment's out of date. All of that kind of stuff. So that's one, the post-peak. Then there's the cultural chaos turnaround. So these ones usually have dysfunctional owners, and look, medicine has its fair share of narcissists and sociopaths and all the rest of it. And so, some of these people find themselves in ownership, and you just have these really dysfunctional, misaligned ownership groups. And sometimes it's just personalities, not necessarily pathology, but, you just get groups of people that for whatever reason don't agree, probably should never have been working together in the first place. Sometimes it's a PM that kind of rules the roost, and which is a little bit like selling a house because you got a bad tenant. They don't ever performance manage or get HR advice as to how they can get the right people in. And so what they do instead is try and sell the whole thing. And then what they want is somebody else to come in and fix the problems that they should have fixed ages ago. The problem is they won't usually tell you this, of course. They try and hide it. It's a little bit like staying with a family for a while. They might be able to play nice for a little while, but eventually you'll get to see all the normal behaviors play out. So there's the cultural chaos turnaround one. And these ones often are a whole bunch of people that have either exited already or are 1 foot out the door. They often look like they'll explode with a moment's notice. So that's one of them. The other one is the sub-economic size. And so this practice is typically the doctor that sets up with 2 or 3 consulting rooms. I'd say sometimes as many as 4. And the problem with those clinics is they're only profitable in the months that all of those rooms are full and humming. And so, 3-4 months of the year, that's not the case. Sometimes they get somebody that goes from full-time to part-time, all of the profitability goes. They're not really businesses. I think they're more like augmented employment opportunities. It's you plus a little bit of extra money from the other people in the building. And they just never really get out of that size. And so I usually find the combination here is that that owner typically owns the building. So it never occurs to them to separate the business from the building. And so it's a little bit like flea training. The story around flea training is put fleas in a jar. I've never tested this, by the way. This is what I've read. Put fleas in a jar. You put the lid on and the flea will bounce against the lid a few times. And then after that, you can take the lid off. And as far as the flea is concerned, that restraint is always in place and will never leave the jar. And that's actually what happens with these owners is they get stuck in these buildings. They assume that those two things must always be together, the building and which they proudly own in their self-managed super fund and the business. And so it never grows to an economic size. And they do that for 20 years. And then at the end of it, they try and sell it. They think it's something awesome because it may well have been when they started. Most people who buy it think that it's a bit frustrating. The biggest mistake people make when they try and buy these is they want to buy the building as well as the business. But what they should be doing is buying the business, relocating it, let that person exit the business. And then you can create, I call this the magic pudding model, where they unlock the capital from owning the building. If they're really lucky, there's still some of these around. They're pre-85 ownership. That sale would be capital gains tax free as well. Or they're freeing money up in their super fund for other purposes. And so there are some good ways around this, but that's the other one. The one that people stay away from, I find really curious, is the well-oiled machine. A really well-run practice, good size, say, somewhere between 6 and 12 GPs, turning over, 3 million or thereabouts and above, good profitability. What people are afraid of is messing it up. And so perversely, when something's great, people get nervous about them making it worse and therefore ruining their return on invested capital. There's no doubt some regression to the mean with anything high performing. Certainly high margin businesses bought at high multiples are much more risky, and you need to be excellent at execution risk, at containing the execution risk and making sure that you continue to grow the business. But those ones people often stay away from, and they're probably good ones to buy, particularly if the purchaser is inexperienced and lacks the resources, skills, and knowledge to turn around a business. Those other ones that I described require substantial resources and knowledge in order to get them right. I mean, you can shortcut that and join Project X, as a lot of members have. But people often like to kind of have inductive learning. They want to pay the dumb tax, and so just do it the slow way. They're the main groups that I think, Sachin. So the startups, the post-peak, the cultural chaos turnaround, the sub-economic size, and the well-oiled machine. I reckon they're the ones that we need to think about.
Nice. It's funny, just as you were talking, I had a conversation with 2 people this morning who are starting their own practice after leaving post-peak practices that had been on the decline. One of them described it as rather than a partnership, it was a dictatorship. Then the cultural chaos turnaround I've shared before in my story when you interviewed me early on in our podcast days. Early on in my journey, I was at that, and me and my business partner, we almost ran away just because of cultural chaos before we tackled it. We did actually speak to an agent, and we were about to just walk away, and that was ridiculously high potential business that we would have just handed over to someone. Sub-economic, just, we've met a few people who've been sort of stitched up, for want of better words, and we'll talk about that in a moment. And then the well-oiled machine, just one of my good friends recently had that very fear. They bought a well-oiled machine. They managed to knock 20%, 25% off because it was a well-oiled machine. The person was aiming for a high multiple, the vendor, but they didn't want to sell it to a corporate. That was one of their key values. And so they came to a negotiated agreement. And exactly as you said it, I mean, we hadn't talked about this before, that their conversations with me were, look, I really don't want to mess this up. Am I going to mess it up? And so very interesting, without any discussion before. That's what I've noticed as well. All right, let's talk the next, actually, just before we go to the next stage. So those are sort of common avatars. Where might someone who's looking, how might they go about finding one of these avatars? What are some tactics they could deploy?
Yeah, I think the first thing is just to make sure you subscribe to the business groups that are actually part of business brokerages that look after general practice, and there's quite a few of those out there. That's one. I think you should, much like when I was having this conversation with a Project X member just in the last few days that was looking to buy another clinic. And I said, look, you should do the same things that you do before you buy a house. You start making a list of the things that you want. How many bedrooms do you want? Do you need to have off-street parking? You want to have a pool? What kind of suburb are you looking at? Because if you start looking for a house and you just go to realestate.com or whatever, and you're just looking in the whole of the city, then, you're going to be distracted and go down a lot of rabbit holes and have no idea. So, all of those things you would do is, how big is it? How much have I got to invest or spend? What do I want to do in terms of the facilities that are part of it? All the same things I think people should be looking at. So one of the things is, what kind of size business do I want to take over? And part of this is a reflection of what are your special skills you bring to this. Do you have some experience with leading or managing teams? Do you have a network of people you could tap into that have those skills? Or maybe you have a network of GPs through, you might be a lead a special interest group, or be a voice for some particular group in general practice, or with maybe one of the colleges. Are there a group of people that look to you for guidance that you think, what, I could use my social media profile to recruit? Do you have business acumen from some area, or are you outstandingly coachable and you just like, I'm just going to get help and come to somebody like us? Actually, there's nobody like us, so you'd come to us. There's no other solution. But just to take that one step further, Sachin, let's say I decided to get into something that I've never done before. Like I wanted to do e-commerce, or I decided I was going to open a bar. Before I even went and did anything, I would join a coaching group. I would actually want to learn all of the things that I need to know before I go into it, just because I don't want to pay the dumb tax. Like I've done that before. I don't want to make the mistakes and learn from them, because they all cost time at least, and money. I would actually prefer to save the loss of time than money. Money's recoverable, time isn't. And so I think it's really important that you just go and make sure that you upskill yourself before you make any of those decisions. So subscribing to those places, once you know the profile, you should share it with those business brokers and say, this is what I'm looking for. Just like you would with a real estate agent. Give them every single element of it that is relevant. And if you have a budget, then share that. The reality is that most banks will give you 100% finance to purchase a general practice if you're a GP. That's a good and a bad thing, because I want you to think about the episode 60 that Sachin and I put together, which is called Buying the Wrong Practice Will Break You. You must go and watch that, because you need to be aware, and I see this all the time, of the common scam of the owner GP not engaging as an independent GP. So therefore they don't have a normal retention of, say, 65%. What they do instead is they leave 100% of their earnings, their billings in the business, and they draw out what they call a profit, which is also dodgy. Your accountant, if they're letting you do that, you probably should be sacking your accountant. But then what they do is they call that profit, like they say a business, and we've seen this very recently, business doing like 1.2 to 1.5 million, and they say the profit is 400,000 or something ridiculous like that, 4 or 500,000. So they say we want $1.5 million for this business. We're only going to sell it on a low multiple. But of course, it's false. If all of those GPs were engaged as normal through a normal non-employment engagement arrangement, often people call them contractors, but we'll just call them independent GPs, where they're retaining 65% and the service fee is 35%. That the business would actually be receiving less than what they are claiming is the profit. And that doesn't account for staff, outgoings, utilities, all of those things. And so you see these patently ridiculous valuations. I see GPs get sucked in on this all the time. Really pisses me off, because you've got professionals that are behaving in an unprofessional manner. Just because you are in a profession, it doesn't mean you are a professional. And this is a shout out to all of the great accountants, the industry specific accountants. I'm going to shout out two of them, Growth MD and William Buck. Go to those guys and you're not going to get scammed like this. That's really important, that doctors do not get scammed, because the episode is called Buying the Wrong Practice Will Break You. It will set you back a decade in your life, maybe 15 years. I've seen awful outcomes for people buying businesses that are complete duds. They were never worth a fraction of what they were paid for, and they're paying for this dud business and the interest on top of it. It is just an absolute millstone around your neck. So don't do that. That's probably the key thing. The other thing, Sachin, is if you know the sort of practice, you've built the profile, you know where they are, go and look for them, knock on the door, have a chat to the owners and call, email, starting conversations. I always find this really interesting. People say, how do I do that? How do I get to speak to owners? You're like, well, you call them, or you reach out to them on social media, or, you email them. And you just say, hey, I'd like to have a conversation. Is this something you've considered? I've bought clinics this way, where people they weren't actually out there actively looking to sell their business, but it had been on their mind for a while. And so just the timing of saying, hey, have you ever thought about it? They're like, actually, I have. I don't know if I ever told you. Did I tell you about the place that I bought with a fax?
I was about to ask you. It's one of my favorite stories. So, well, actually, don't say it yet. We'll come back to it. All right. So we'll come back to this story, because this is a great story. But there's just one thing I wanted to pick up on. Before we go back to that, you talked about the sub-economic and people the 2, 3, maybe 4 room practice, and people getting sort of into that without open eyes. I think there's something to be said. The thing that I wrote down when you were talking about that was options. Often what I've found from the conversations, we get to have with the thousands of owners, one of those recurring conversation is, I was there and this person offered me to buy it, and so I bought it. And so I think there's something really important that people who are listening or watching this will be maybe thinking about buying. I think the bit that people skip quite often is creating a panel of options and being very clear on the criteria. So I think just what you talked about, I just want to spend a bit of time on that, because what happens is that they don't create options. They take what's served to them by someone else. It almost feels in that situation that this opportunity won't arise. I'm really lucky. I should just take it, which is sometimes our brain playing a trick on us. So we create this urgency and scarcity that, I have to act on this because this opportunity won't arise. But those people haven't actually, when you ask them, stepped back, created a panel of options, seen what their investment could get them as an asset, and therefore just blindly commit. So I'll be interested in your perspective on that.
Yeah. Look, I think the real estate example is probably another good one here, Sachin, right? So you and I are buying a property and we decide that we've got a pretty good idea about what we want. And we go and approach somebody who's owner of that type of property, and they say, I want this much money. You would reasonably then go and compare, what else can I get with that money? That would be the next most sensible thing to do. And when people are presented with a purchase opportunity, the things that they need to ask themselves, what time will it take me? How long will it take me to recoup this investment? So we call that a cash on cash return. So if you're really clever at buying businesses and you buy ones that are valued towards the lower end of the spectrum and you're talented in turnarounds, you might be able to get a cash on cash return in something like 18 months to 2 years. So you completely liquidate your purchase cost in that time. So the cash on cash return, like how long would it take me to get my money back? And you need to be able to go through every line item to be able to determine where there's excess value that either hasn't been identified or there are overheads that can be cut. The second thing is the vendor. What's going to happen to the vendor as part of the purchase? This is a really important consideration. In many cases, it's probably desirable that they are exiting, just because the owner or owners will typically have a dynamic in the clinic where people are used to asking them for advice. It's actually quite hard to break. And so if you own something, it would be a little bit like buying a house and the old owners still being in the house when you moved in and you had to ask permission to do things. So I think you need some kind of a clear plan as to what the exit looks like. This is my preference when you buy businesses from doctors, is that I would never mandate that they did minimum hours like they would with a corporate. What I would do, though, is make sure that they had a really strong non-compete. Now, I know people think that non-competes aren't enforceable as part of a sale of business agreement. They most definitely are. They are in other circumstances too, but that's up to you and your lawyer to talk about. And so, for example, what I mean is you might say that for a period of, say 5 years, and a reasonable zone around the practice, that the person is prevented from working in that area in competition. And you should have some anti-poaching clauses as well that prevent them from poaching the people. And what you could do is either have that you would actually go through that with your lawyers if and when it happened, or you might actually say there's a dollar amount payable in the event that you poach doctors or nurses or staff, etc. And so you can actually have all of that in the agreement. A good lawyer will be able to go through all this with you. I really like to give vendors freedom about what they do in the clinic, but a lack of freedom about the competition against an asset that they've sold, which I think is completely reasonable. The other thing, Sachin, is that if you're buying one of these sub-economic size clinics, you should make sure. So one of the tricks of the dodgy vendor is to recut the lease at the time of sale and pump it right up. So you see these people paying leases that are well above market and locking them in for a long period of time. So part of your negotiation needs to include the lease either continuing on the same terms as which the business valuation was created, or the business valuation is adjusted for the new lease, i.e. The business valuation is reduced, because you can't have it both ways. And so I think the other thing that you can do is, particularly if you buy one of these little clinics, is just consider it like a node. So you remember when you did those crystals in chemistry back in the day, and your copper sulfate had the bit of string, and you created a node, and then the massive crystal grew from that. Just consider this sub-economic business as the node, the kernel for something much bigger to grow, but you need to relocate it. You're going to need a little bit of time to find alternative premises. If it's early on in your career, it may be that you're leasing those. If it's later on and you have the capital available, you may buy the premises. That's probably going to take you two to 3 years if you want to buy them and fit them out. Maybe more like 12 to 18 months if you're going to find somewhere to lease and have it fitted out. But again, just make sure that whatever you agree to, it does accommodate your needs well. And then you want to make sure that it's closed for a period of time such that, they couldn't just set up another general practice in there afterwards. You can't really prevent that because you don't own the building, but you just want to make sure that you're not making it too easy for the next person. And you certainly want to make sure that your agreement prevents the vendor from setting up in competition in the old premises. I've seen some pretty unethical things done before as well. They're probably the main things. The other thing here, Sachin, is that in creating those options, people should never, never, never engage amateur advisors. So the lawyers must be health experts. The accountants, we mentioned them earlier, must be health experts. I think this is really, really important for people to not nickel and dime. I was having a chat to some boardroom members in Project X recently, and they're looking at expanding from 2 to 3 clinics. And again, we were having this conversation about what types of clinics to buy. I said, what I recommend you do is you put aside a war chest of somewhere between $70,000 and $100,000, which will give you enough budget to do due diligence on 3 advanced, negotiations, because you're probably going to need somewhere between $20,000 and $30,000 to go through all of this with those experts. Now, I know there's going to be people listening that think I can do this cheaper or I'll do it myself. And you just see this ending in tears. The number of people I've seen, the 2 things that come to mind are a clinic worth $600,000 actually that was bought for $600,000 that I think was worth zero. Another one that was bought for more than $1 million that was probably worth more like 100,000. I've seen the lack of willingness to spend $20,000 cost people $1 million. And that is 500 times more expensive without getting to the interest. So I really want people to understand that you must get professional advice. We've had some recent people join Project X, which is breaking our rules, that are in this part where they're close to transacting, and such, and the value you can add from, being in the space for 20 to 25 years is enormous. And so because most of the other vendors or most of the other advisors have some kind of conflict. If the buyer's agent, obviously they're working for the transaction, not necessarily conflicts with experts, but if you don't give a good brief, it could easily blow out the cost. So you need to make sure that it's really tightly designed brief as to what's expected from these people. And there are some good tools that you can get through Cubico, by the way, that allow you to get some information dumps out of best practice. And so that can be super useful when it comes to the finances. Hopefully I covered the things that were in your mind. Was there anything there that perhaps we could build out on or add to?
Yeah, you went ahead and added a couple of things, so that was great. I think you've covered most of the things that people should be thinking about once they found a practice. And we've talked about episode 60 and the valuation trap. What other traps might someone expect? And I'm conscious everyone wants to hear your story about the way you bought the practice, my favorite story, but we'll come to that. But what traps in the purchase process that you haven't already talked about should people be aware of? One of the ones that comes to mind for me is that you spoke about is, when advisors are working on both sides of the deal. But it would be great. You're good at spotting the traps, so I'd love to hear about any of those.
Yeah, so you just mentioned a really good one. I have seen one where somebody bought a business. So I was like, this whole thing sounds dodgy. And I said, who was your advisor? And they said they were recommended by the vendor's accountant. I just said, look, you need true independent advice. You actually want people to tell you the things you don't know. And so your job in due diligence is to discover what they call the black swans, the things that the other side doesn't want you to know. And so you can include some of these conditions as part of conditions precedent and subsequent by agreement, which just means you've got to have these ducks lined up before and after these things need to happen. So, I would be concerned about a lot of personal relationships in the business. So, for example, buying a business where a cousin, a wife, somebody else in the family is the practice manager. It's not an absolute exclusion, but that there may be some issues around loyalties or a lot of family in the business. Now, these are also good opportunities as well if you manage them the right way, because sometimes those people, it can be a little bit like Stockholm syndrome. So I've bought clinics before where the people actually didn't really want to be working there, but did it out of obligation. And so they're more than happy for the sale, because then they could say, look, we won't continue. But there just needs to be a high degree of clarity around that. Same thing with doctors that are planning to exit, things that haven't been declared. I've seen sham agreements with floor space being subleased. In this circumstance, this was Allied Health. It was for above market, and all those leases strangely disappeared after the transaction. I'm going to say completely predictably. In this case, I came to this transaction late, but it had already been locked in, and I just remember seeing things that you just knew were fraudulent. So you need people that are experienced, because they can spot where the trouble is. In this circumstance, I was talking about fraudulent leases there or arrangements. They were actually verified by tier one accounting firms and legal firms. But what they were verifying was that the money went into the account and that the agreement existed. But there was no sense checking that actually this is above market, and so somebody who knows the business would be like, and this is really unusual. This doesn't look like the right thing. And so I think, you do need to be able to spot bullshit and know where to look. So I always think that you got to know where the bodies are buried in a spreadsheet, and the right people can do that. And then the lawyers are there to make sure that you don't kind of end up missing out on getting an asset or ownership of something that you should, and you don't end up taking on obligations that you shouldn't. So that's really important to just get subject matter experts, because there are a lot of liabilities and problems you could be buying into. HR is the other one too, Sachin. Of course, you're going to need to assign agreements and make offers. not all of the people in the business should remain there. It would be rare that that's the case. So people should restart their trial periods. And during that time, you need to be pretty quick on making decisions as to who goes and who stays. And one thing that I'm just going to say now is nobody should ever buy a business and say, just promise yourself that you will never say, don't worry, nothing is going to change here. The urge people have to say that, and there's two problems with it. A lot of the time, people want things to change. They're thinking this is a good opportunity for renewal and some improvement. So don't assume things are great. That's the first thing. The second thing is, if you're going to buy something and not change it, then you might as well just buy shares on the ASX. The whole point of buying a business is to add your spin and your flavor to the business. You just shut your mouth and completely resist the urge to say something stupid. Don't ever type it. Don't ever write it. Don't ever say it. Just don't do it. I've seen so many people do it.
Thank you, Todd. Let's give me an idea. We will record an episode, which is I've just bought a practice. What do I do next? That will be one of our upcoming episodes. Now, Todd, this is your moment, the moment we've been building up for. We've talked about, looking for a practice, the types of practices people might find. Then we've talked about creating options when someone offers you a practice. And with that, we also talked about the things people should consider in the buying process and some of the biggest traps. I'll just re-highlight one that in case people may have skipped over it. HR is super important because there may be, whatever the business model and the financial model is, may be affected if the person wasn't compliant, and that may substantially affect the business actual valuation as well as liabilities. And so that's an important one. If you didn't hear that the first time, I said it a second time. Now, Todd, this is your moment to close us out. The day I bought a practice by fax. Over to you.
All right. So I'll share some context. So I managed to get a great space. It's more than 5 years and less than 10 years ago. So in that bracket. And so I ended up negotiating this space that was 500 square meters of space at about $300 a square meter in a prime retail strip. Excellent location, great space, like a nice, neat envelope to build within. Not much in the way of pillars. It was a double-story building, second story, and good tenants either side. And I also negotiated that the landlord would pay for the fit out. So that was a separate deed, and that was another 500 grand, but it was 50K per annum that I paid in the end of 10 years. That was all. So it was an interest-free loan basically from the owner. And they also project managed everything. So I didn't have to do anything. So anyway, I get this, new clinic, brand new, everything in there, exactly to spec, for a really good price. And, we were just going to have to start it from scratch. It was greenfields. And I thought, it'd be really nice if there was a small clinic nearby that was a bit tired that we could relocate. Just a bunch of doctors that would get into new premises. They could remove all the hassles of ownership. There's a lot of those, the past the peak businesses around it. And lo and behold, there's one about 300 meters away. Really old and scungy looking building, clinic tired as hell. I called a few times, pretty inefficient admin services. The message never really got through, or if it got through, nothing happened with it. So emails, phone calls, nothing happened. So sitting there, I was thinking, this is a really good deal for these guys. And I've had this experience before, relocating clinics of say 4 to 6 GPs. And what happened was every one of the doctors earned much more than they did previously because they just didn't have modern systems, processes, really good people around them. And so they always did better. They always had less stress, and it was a really good win-win-win. And so I'm thinking I really need to get to a point where these people say no so I can move on. And I thought, what could I do? Anyway, I was sitting in a doctor's waiting room as a patient, and there was a bunch of those old magazines, your People magazines or whatever, from like 10 years ago. And it occurred to me, I thought, I wonder what it would be like to send a ransom note to as a style of communication to the clinic. So anyway, I said to them, could I have the some of these old magazines? And they looked at me quizzically. They're like, what? Yeah, whatever. Like their 10, 15-year-old magazines, the ones that are still talking about Lady Di and all that kind of stuff. Anyway, so I've taken these old magazines and I've cut out the letters and I've just put, do you want to sell your clinic? A question mark, and then call, with my number. And I faxed it to them because I figured that the old clinic would definitely respond to faxes. And it worked. They called had a conversation, and they ended up selling it. They moved in. They sold their building for an absolute bomb because that was able to be redeveloped by somebody else. And again, they loved it. They were having a ball. They got to meet the mayor when the mayor came to open the clinic and cut the ribbon and all that stuff. And it was really good. Everybody got what they needed out of it. And it was the only clinic I've ever bought with a fax. And it was a ransom note style with clag and cutting the letters out.
Many practices, fax lines will be jammed today and other day when this is released. Todd, that's been awesome. Today we've spoken about buying a practice. Coming up, we will have a podcast on I've bought my practice. I'm about to take over. What next? I've been Sachin. I was about to say I've been Todd, but I've been Sachin. He's been Todd. We'll see you next time.